My name is Jeanette Dorfman, and I'm a member of the board of League, and the board is thankful to the Wolfsonian FIU for being our longtime cultural partner and for hosting this event and lecture at their beautiful institution. And for those of you who are not members of the Miami Design Preservation League, please join our website. Go on there, join if you haven't joined already. Members receive free walking tours, discounts to the gift shop, an incredible newsletter that lets you know what's happening everywhere in the city of Miami Beach, including other cultural institutions. I read it. I'm a local. I learn what's happening in our beautiful city because I receive this wonderful newsletter. So I highly encourage you to join, get the newsletter. Also, I want to remind you that, your donations help support our mission. Which is to preserve, to promote, and to protect Miami Beach and beyond. And we do that with your donations. So, obviously we've seen that this year, we're at a critical juncture with historical preservation, and Miami Design Preservation League is working hard to ensure that our mission can be sustained, and we need your donations to do that. So now please join me in welcoming Rosa Lowinger, our featured speaker here at the beautiful Wolfsonian FIU. Rosa is a Cuban-born American writer, curator, and an art conservator. Ms. Lowinger is considered a leader in the field of conservation. She has supervised various large-scale architectural projects, including the facade of this beautiful building, the Vizcaya Museum Gardens, and the Miami Marine Stadium. This lecture will be based on her just published memoir, Dwell Time. And after the talk, please stay, buy the book, and please stay and for the book signing. And now, without any further ado, the woman who has been called the genius of architectural conservation, Rosa Lowinger.
Oh, no. Let's wait. Let's go back. We gotta go. Oh, there we go. Thank you. That is... am I live here? I'm on this mic. Thank you. So should I push this one away so we don't, it doesn't matter. They're not live. Thank you. I can use both. Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much for that insanely overwhelming introduction. And thank you everyone for being here on this beautiful day and to hear a little bit about my work and about preservation in Miami and elsewhere and why it's so vital and critical and important. I am delighted to be here at the Wolfsonian, which is truly one of my favorite institutions and a museum that I've spent a lot of time working at. I've worked on a lot of projects here that I was actually even going to show, but it seemed superfluous to do so, though I am going to get back to some of them later. This talk today is going to be a hybrid. I'm going to be talking about my memoir, Dwell Time, a memoir of art, exile, and repair that came out in October of this past year, and about the whole concept of how my field, which is art conservation and architectural conservation, provides a framework and a metaphor for repair and for thinking about repair as a way of not just something that is material, but something that is more personal. And the reason this book came to be because for many years I'd been thinking about writing a book about conservation for a general audience, because our work lives a little bit in the shadows of other people's work, the shadows of the curator, the shadow of the architect. And sometimes people don't really understand what it is we do. I see one of my favorite conservation colleagues, Rusty Levinson, in the background, talk about a genius of our field. Our work isn't really very well understood. It's considered technical and hands-on, but what people fail to understand is that it is based on a lot of thought. In the same way, without sounding self-important, that surgery is not just simply someone putting their hands on something, on a body or a body part, but it's part of a holistic understanding of what it means to preserve something. And the title of my book, Dwell Time, comes from a term in our field. It's a term that can mean many things to different fields. So, for example, it's used to measure the amount of time that someone spends surfing a website. It's called the dwell time. But in the field of conservation, it is specific to one idea, and that is how long it takes a chemical to work on a surface. And there's an inverse relationship between the strength of a chemical and how long it takes. So for example, if you're using a very harsh paint stripper to remove a paint, it takes a shorter period of time than if you use something else. Or similarly, in the parlance of the post-pandemic world, we wash our hands for 20 seconds with soap because that's the dwell time required to remove for soap to kill a virus. Whereas if you use alcohol on your hands, that's a much shorter, quicker thing because the alcohol is much stronger. And it resonates with the theme of the book, which is about where you live and where you grow up and how your family's intergenerational trauma impacts what you become, but how those places where you grow up and where your life takes place also contain those stories. And that's kind of the basis of why preservation is important. So I'm going to start here by telling you just a little bit about myself before I move into some stories of actual tales of conservation and preservation here in Miami. I was born in Havana, the once magnificent waterfront city that you see on this slide in all its beauty and glory. It's actually still a magnificent city, though it's in terrible disrepair. But what makes it magnificent is that it has its historic places there. In Cuba, unlike in most places, people who wish to destroy historic buildings do so by something that we call demolition by neglect. In Cuba, it's kind of the inverse. It's preservation by neglect. The reason buildings are there is because developers have not had agency. There's been no development since 1959, when the state took ownership of all buildings. There was no private incentive to develop anything, no economic viability for any of that. So buildings remain. Now, some things are reaching a critical point, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the fact is that while something exists, there's a hope for it to be resuscitated. But once the wrecking ball comes through, it's gone. There's no bringing the doorbell back. But even the worst, most damaged building in Havana still has a chance. So, to the personal. So, my parents were both born in Cuba. They were first generation Cubans. Their parents were Eastern European Jews who came to Cuba in the 1920s, both from different parts of Romania, of similar background, but they could not have been more different as families. Where my father's family was industrious and hardworking, nose to the grindstone type of people, my mother had nothing but tragedy in her life. But before I get to her, my father's family was industrious. They made money they got there in 26, and by 1950, they had enough money to build a building, which you see here. I don't need the pointer. It's the one with the blue balconies. That building is in a waterfront neighborhood of Havana known as Vedado, which is a middle class, it was developed in the late 19th century. It has its own, very, layered history, but it was developed very prominently in the 1940s and 50s. And in 1950, when my grandfather had gathered a little bit of money, was more or less the year that my father graduated from high school. And my father wanted to be an architect. His father said, no way. You're not going to be an architect. I didn't come to this country to start a business so that my eldest son was going to work for someone else. But as a concession to my father, he bought a plot of land and let him design this building, which my father did by poring over magazines and designed something actually much grander and more, as he put it, futuristic than this. But my grandfather scaled back the building. Nonetheless, it has beautiful decorative details inside of it. So while it looks like a rather ordinary, what we call in the field, everyday ordinary modernism or ordinary everyday modernism, inside it has a lot of fingerprints of great love, if you will. So for example, this black terrazzo floor with large white inclusions, that staircase, that faux rock wall, which is not in fact limestone, but it is cast stone, which is another topic I'm going to get to soon, or the wall surface that looks like marble on the image on your right that is actually a painted finish. These speak to someone who cares a lot about decoration. And that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, because as a conservator, I like to make the case for the fact that the details are the important part. It's not enough to preserve the footprint of a building if you gut it and take away its character and interests. It's these details that make them special. So, as I mentioned, my mother was raised in was raised with great tragedy in her life. She was raised in an orphanage, even though her father was alive. And then once she left the orphanage, in appalling conditions of poverty. When she married my father, that gave her a little bit of a ticket out of that world. And she breathed a sigh of relief and was a bit less overwrought by the things that had happened to her in life. But the revolution kind of put an end to her well-being. And when we came here, this is us here on the beach, about really 3 blocks from where we're standing right now, my mother and I and a daughter of a friend of ours. And then that's my family. We had a very small immediate family there. It was me and my parents. I have no sibling. Oh, well, that's not true. I have a sibling, but he was born many years later. I was raised more or less as an only child for many years. And my my father's brother and my mother's brother lived with us in a 1-bedroom apartment on Drexel Avenue at 14th Street, very close to where we're standing. So, you know, there's a lot of story that goes with what happened when we came from Cuba. And really that's the crux of a section of my book that takes me from being a resident of Miami to wanting to flee this city like gangbusters as soon as I was able to when I went to college. Part of it was wanting to just escape family trauma. And some of it, as I write in my book, was to just get away from all the cloying nostalgia that Miami tends to have with it, especially among the Cuban population. This idea of like, you know, what we lost, what was no longer there. It's not so much the case now, but back in the 70s, in the 60s, Cubans here just couldn't believe what had happened. We've sort of grown a little accustomed to it now. But my goal when I was leaving for college was to get away and never come back. And I went to college in Boston and chanced upon, through a series of coincidences and fortunate accidents that I'll allow you to read in my book, found myself backing into this profession called art conservation in the late 1970s at a very key moment in the field when the field was just developing into something that went from being artisanal to scientific. And it started a few years earlier, but really it was like this, in the late 60s, early 70s, conservation went from being sort of like a basement dwelling profession to really something that had some teeth. And I'm not going to read from my book too much, but I want to read to you one section about my first job, because something became very clear to me then. I studied in New York at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, and then shortly thereafter was doing an internship at the Metropolitan Museum right at the moment when they were developing and reimagining and building the new building for the American wing that was built by Roche Dinkeloo, that's on the southern end of the Met. And I'm sorry, it's in the back in another section of the Met. And my project there, I was assigned with a number of NYU graduate students to work on the Vanderbilt mantle that had been designed by American artists John Lafarge and Augustus St. Gaudens for the grand entryway of Cornelius Vanderbilt II's mansion on Fifth Avenue. So let me read you this little brief section from that project. The mantle is made of, and this is, of course, the mantle in its restored state. But when we were working on it, it was completely taken apart and in terrible condition. The mantle is made of oak, mosaic, iron, and Numidian marble, a rare maroon red stone with white veining and gray striations. Most prominent among its features are a pair of larger-than-life-size classical female caryatids who hold up the entablature and mosaic on bowed heads and upraised arms. In 1925, when Vanderbilt's mansion was demolished, the mantelpiece was donated to the Met by his widow and later loaned to the New Whitney Museum. By the time it returned to the Met for installation in the American wing, the caryatids were missing. It's not clear at what point they were removed from the whole, but they were eventually found lying in the ground of a garden belonging to Cornelius's daughter, Gertrude Vanderbilt, a sculptor in her own right. When I started work at the Met, the American wing was a construction site, humid with the scent of wet concrete, noisy with motors, hammering, workers shouting, and gantry chains that were clattering as they hoisted the brightly glazed floral ceramic capitals of Louis Comfort Tiffany's onto fluted columns. Outside the floor-to-ceiling window wall, however, was Central Park, dappled with early autumn's blush. I sat hunched on the floor in a corner of the atrium, trying to make sense of this amazing piece of art that was broken, and also the marble of the caryatids that was so scoured by the salt air of Long Island that they didn't even seem to be of the same marble as the other mantel parts. I wondered, how could I even begin to deal with these missing bits, a splintering mosaic, and these caryatids whose marble was so eroded that the hard white veins of calcite stood proud of the surface like sugared icing on a cake. Those questions are actually answered in an academic paper that I wrote in 1980. But not included in that essay was the first essential principle I learned about conservation. Our field is a mix of art, science, and hand skills, but it is fundamentally the art of understanding damage and knowing what to do about it. You can't repair what you don't comprehend. You need to know the chemical makeup of the Numidian marble to understand that the iron inclusions that give it that deep red color also make it susceptible to salt damage. Where the material comes from, what it was intended to do, and what had happened to it along the way was the basis of its treatment. These are the things you need to know about works of art before you begin to conserve them. They're also a guide to how to deal with people. So the crux of my book is just that, understanding that damage is a prelude to repair. And it's really interesting because a great rabbi and scholar named Rabbi Sharon Brous has just published an extraordinary book called The Amen Effect about healing and repair. And she deals quite on her own, through a different theological way, comes to some of the same conclusions, that when you look at another human being and you can see to their damage and what is causing them to be so fractured and splintered, that's the basis of repair on a personal or a global level. But back to materials conservation. What happened to me to change a lot of my thinking, and what really led to this book, was that I became this conservator. I moved to California. I was clear in the idea that I could not come to Miami to practice this profession because in the 1970s, there was really no culture of preservation here, or certainly not conservation. But also, there was another piece of it. In 1992, for the first time, I went back to Cuba. I had no idea what there was in Cuba. And this is not Cuba. This is me in Los Angeles working on the Watts Towers, Simon Rodia's Watts Towers, which is a masterwork of outsider art. And the reason I show it is, first of all, because I went back to Cuba while I was working on this piece, but it was this piece that got me there because someone invited me to give a paper on the project at a preservation conference in Havana in 1992. This was right after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Cuba was struggling so much to get a sense of what way it was going to make a living because the Soviet Union had pulled all its funding, and they had pivoted through certain sectors into trying to lure cultural tourism. So there were a lot of different types of conferences. And someone invited me to give this paper, and it was kind of an incredible experience because I went to Cuba not knowing anything about what I was going to find. When I grew up here in Miami, when I heard about everything we had lost, it was all at the personal level. It was we lost our homes, our livelihood, our family. But I didn't realize this was there as well. And for me, who was a conservator, who worked on materials to collide with this city that was not only full of historic buildings, but historic buildings that were full of decorative materials that were unique, like you would find in any European capital. I mean, I suppose some of you here have been to Havana. I know some of you in this room have because I know you and I've gone with you. But the reality of it is that Havana has a layered wealth of decorative details that tell the entire story of the Western Hemisphere in a way that you couldn't really see anywhere else because it's all there, beginning in the 16th century, continuing into the 20th, and more or less uninterrupted. And for me, who's a conservator, the beauty is in those decorative details. It's not just the Art Deco tower that is the Bacardi Tower that you see on the far right, but it's the fact that it's covered in glazed terracotta. Or they have the original Havana Hilton building in the center from 1958 that was then changed to Habana Libre. But the fact that that building is covered in works of art by some of the most famous Cuban artists of the period, and that was a thing that was done that was very unique to Cuban culture in that period, to really use the top artists of the time period to create artworks for buildings. And then it's in the materials itself. As someone who works at the very minute level of materials, to see concrete used in so many unique ways. There is this, here you have a sculpture in front of the Havana Riviera Hotel that was designed by Miami architect Igor Polovitsky. The developer was Meyer Lansky, and this is an important sculpture by one of Cuba's most significant artists, Florencio Gelaber. The arched building is by Max Borges Recio, who also designed another building that I'm going to show you in a minute that really influenced me. And then down below, you have what was called the Centro Gallego, a building from much earlier, from 4 decades earlier, from the beginning of the 20th century, that is by the Belgian architect Paul Belleau, that also uses decorative concrete. And I've done a lot of thinking and working and studying of concrete. I'm going to show you a couple of key projects in a few minutes. But one of the things about concrete is that concrete is a product of the late 19th century. The Romans had Roman concrete thousands of years earlier, but the technology of concrete fell away in the Middle Ages, and it only got revitalized in the mid-19th century. And what we know of as modern Portland cement-based concrete is a totally new type of material that really made possible every type of building that you see more or less everywhere in the city and almost everywhere. And what made it possible was using steel reinforcement rods to reinforce the concrete so you could build shapes like these very thin arches. So similarly, this is another key thing that I saw in Havana that I was so unprepared for, which was just whimsical, interesting, decorative details in neighborhoods that were not grand. They were not marvelous. This is the mosaic facade, the abstract mosaic facade of a movie theater in a random neighborhood of Havana. These are the cast iron painted swans on the Bocoy rum factory in Havana. And for many years, I tried to work in Cuba. That was like, once I discovered Cuba, to me, it was like, that's what I want to do. I want to work here. I want to bring a branch of my firm here, because it felt utterly serendipitous to have this training that was so necessary in Cuba. And it isn't that Cuban professionals didn't know what they were doing. They did, but they lacked continuity to what the greater field was doing outside of certain very limited places in the world. So all I wanted to do was work in Cuba. And of course, all the laws of the embargo made it impossible. The only thing that I was able to do was to teach. And so I taught a couple of classes. That's me teaching a bronze patination class at the Cementerio Colón in about 1995. And the other images of the first time that I went to the Jewish cemetery in Guanabacoa, Cuba, and met Luis Lapidus, a man a little bit younger than my parents, who, like my parents, was an Eastern European Jewish-born Cuban. His parents had immigrated to Cuba, and he was born there, but he decided to stay. And he was the deputy director of the National Conservation Center, and took me to the Jewish cemetery, where I made some radical discoveries that, again, I will let you discover in my book. I made a lot of connections with my Cuban colleagues. This is the paintings conservation studio at the National Museum of Fine Arts. It's very rudimentary, as my colleague will tell you, but they were trying to do good work. The idea of doing good work in conservation means approaching everything with a very healthy dose of doubt, because what we do is we approach repair in a way that allows our work to be undone by someone else, or if not undone, at least retreated by someone else without consequence to the artwork, because that is the difference between repair and conservation. It's that eye to knowing that the future might teach you something that you don't know now, and allowing for an ability to make it better in the future. Because sometimes when you intervene too harshly, you limit that possibility. In the mid-1990s, when I was doing a lot of travel to Cuba, I began also taking tour groups to Cuba. And I wasn't taking the tour groups. I was asked to lead people on study groups of Havana, because, again, Havana tells such an extraordinary story about the Western Hemisphere. And I found myself visiting the Tropicana nightclub, which was a place that my parents talked about and all of their friends talked about with a great deal of kind of overwrought nostalgia, as if it were, this is the 1960s, when we could not have cared less about that kind of music anymore. And, my folks and their friends are really just feeling the loss of this place where they spent so much of their youth hanging out. And when I got there, I was bowled over myself. But by then it was because I recognized in that building that you see on your left, striking modernism of a type that you don't see anywhere else. And in fact, this is the indoor nightclub at the Tropicana Cabaret called Arcos de Cristal, which is considered the finest modernist building in the Caribbean. It's basically, by the same guy that did the Nautico before. It's a series, it's 6 3-inch thick concrete poured-in-place arches that are concentric and asymmetrical and telescope toward a stage. The only thing that creates this building is these arches and bits of glass in between them. And to me, the idea that this nightclub that was of my parents' generation could so dovetail with something that meant so much to me was kind of like a link of things. This morning when Lee Nicholas was speaking, she said, everything is connected. Speaking of exactly, I think, a different, about Mickey Wolfson being related to the people of the Norris Theater who gave the Norris facade that's in the lobby. And I thought about that very much about Tropicana and my family and me, and linked through its materiality in particular. Just gonna have a drink so I don't start coughing. So my desire to work in Cuba and do something there, it ebbed and flowed. I kept doing like back channel type of consultation on things, wanting to set up a whole practice there. The Obama administration, allowed the possibility to be really palpable. It never happened. But in the meantime, I wrote a lot of things about Cuba. I wrote a book about Tropicana. I wrote the initial story in Preservation magazine about the restoration of Old Havana. And I was fortunate to be asked by the Wolfsonian to co-curate a show with Frank Luca, the archivist and librarian here, based on an important collection that they have here and the book is called Promising Paradise, Cuban Allure, American Seduction, and this is a separate funny story, is when I was writing the Tropicana book, I wanted to amass photographs so I could, look at piece images of Cuba in the 50s, and every time a piece went up on eBay, I never got it. I never was able to buy one single thing because there was someone else who was always getting them. And that someone else is a woman named Vicki Gold-Levy, who someone introduced me to eventually, and we became very close friends. And Vicki has donated her vast collection of Cuban memorabilia, photographs, and artifacts to the Wolfsonian, which was the basis of Promising Paradise, the exhibit. And again, everything's connected. So that's kind of part one of my book, about how the accident of history that allowed for the preservation by neglect of Havana, and that brought my parents here, and that the family trauma that really repelled me made me leave, and that I somehow lucked into this profession, kind of links everything together. And that's really the basis of the book that I wrote, and it's tied through materials. The book is organized around materials. The section that I read to you before is about marble, obviously. But now I want to kind of pivot to talking a little bit about specific projects, specific historic preservation projects at their material conservation level. And I'm not doing this chronologically. I'm doing this starting with the dearest first, the Wolfsonian. This is so this building, we're sitting in it. One of the things that this building is an extraordinary building, but one of its chief characteristics is this gorgeous facade frieze that you see. And the two ribbon friezes that run along the facade and the portal. And the portal is made out of decorative cast stone. It's from 1926. Decorative cast stone is essentially a type of concrete. Concrete has many different types, and cast stone is just so designated by the mix and the type of aggregate. Because what concrete essentially is, it's a mortar. Usually in concrete, it's Portland cement with an aggregate and with colorants in it and sand. And so there is a vast amount of this material in places like Miami, Los Angeles, and Havana. And these materials, which appear extremely robust, and, people think of concrete as extremely durable, and it is. But if concrete is based on the marriage between the cement matrix and the steel, and if the steel gets exposed for any reason, if there's a crack in it, and you don't fix it, it's just going to be a snowball effect of damage. In my book, in the chapter on concrete, I liken the type of strong symbiotic relationship that concrete has between mortar and steel, and how a tiny fissure and lack of repair destroys it, to the way marriage works. A marriage can be very good if the two pieces work together very well, but if it starts to fray and you don't repair, it really goes fast. So what happened here in the mid-2000s, I guess this had happened before, because in around 2010, I had just come back to Miami to start a conservation firm here. This is in 2009, I did that. And in 2010, I was called by a contractor working on this building because they had scaffolding up around the building for years, because bits of the cast stone were raining off the surface. And wait, I'm just looking at the time. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through this. So essentially what had to be done is we had to really address it. And there's only one way to address it: to go to every single piece of iron that is in this surface that is breaking through and fix it. And sometimes it's gone too far and you have to take it out. So we did, and we took it out and we cleaned the surface and we made repairs. And I just looked at the outside of the building and the repairs still hold. They had been redone. When we got the project in 2010, it had been done a few years earlier, just a few years earlier. Wasn't that right, Richard? It was just, somebody else had done it a few years earlier and it started failing. Oh, okay, that's not too bad. But they hadn't actually protected the steel, and that's why it started coming apart again. Another project that I've done quite a bit of work on is Vizcaya. And Vizcaya is probably known to everybody here. It was the winter home of James Deering of the International Harvester of Fortune. It's a grand, historic Mediterranean villa that is intended to look as if it were hundreds of years old. It's a bit of a pastiche of all sorts of things. But it too has really interesting materials. It's made of cast concrete and stucco and has lots of decorative cast concrete decorative details and also limestone. And the first project that I was called to do here was to do a survey of all the outdoor sculpture at Vizcaya in preparation for a grant that the museum had received to do work on all the sculptures. And the way this grant went is you couldn't do the work unless you had a survey done, but you couldn't have the person who did the survey actually apply for the money to do the work. So no conservator who was interested in the project wanted to do it. But I was about to embark on a trip on a one-year project in Rome, so I did that survey. And it was really extraordinary to see this was right here. Because I'd been to Vizcaya as a child like everyone else. And when I became a conservator, I had gone there a couple of times to see if they wanted me to work on anything, and they had a restorer working there who wanted nothing to do with me. So when I was called in, it was a great moment. And over the years, we've done a lot of things for them, helped them find proper paint mixes for their walls, had them worked on their pavers, did an entire survey of all their interior decorative features, which if you haven't been there, you should go. It's really quite an amazing place. They have an amazing collection of really well-made European decorative finishes. And in the mid-2000s, when they had their canopy redone because their canopy was leaking and it was really a cumbersome building, we did the conservation oversight, which means you have a conservator on the site to make sure that the contractors don't damage the historic fabric of a building while it's being done. And that's the right way to do a proper preservation project for a historic building like this. Recently, after the terrible collapse of the Champlain Towers, we were brought in to do what is called a sounding survey of the entire facade. And that really literally means is that you get on a lift and with something called a sounding hammer, which is a rubber mallet, you hit the entire surface and hear if you have anything hollow. And if there was anything hollow, it had to be pinned back in place. And now there's a requirement that buildings like this have to be sounded every few years. Apparently in New York City, it's become a bit of a problem right now that a lot of the glazed terracotta on buildings is collapsing. It's falling in small bits. So that's why you see scaffolding all over New York on all these avenues, because there's all these sounding surveys going on to repair some of those finishes. We recently redid the herms on the barge, the Vizcaya barge, and we worked a lot on the barge. Barge, you can imagine, takes a beating for being in the water, and these were two different examples. One had to be completely recast because it was no longer viable, and one could be repaired. I'm going to flip through some of these because I have a couple of projects that I really want to focus on. This is work we've done on the Coral Gables entrances and plazas. A lot of them get hit by drunk drivers. There's a lot of drunk drivers in Coral Gables, and they're constantly crashing into these walls. And since they're rubble walls, they need to be put back together in a way that looks right. Because the thing is, if you use the wrong mortar mixes for these limestone walls, they're just going to not only look terrible, but they're going to fall apart. We worked on City Hall a couple of times. I did an entire survey of all the features of City Hall in preparation for more work and also paver work. And one of the things is, you know, the finials on the top of City Hall that you can see there in that middle slide on the top, every single one of them was loose. And so they had a grant and we went up and just secured them in place so that it didn't kill somebody. I'm going to flip through this one really quickly because I'm going to talk a little bit about painted sculpture. You know, this sculpture, this is the Oldenburg site-specific piece on, well, I'm not going to flip. I'll just tell you. This is the Oldenburg site-specific sculpture in downtown Miami. Miami has some incredible works of public art. For example, the Roy Lichtenstein mermaid that is on 17th Street, that is Lichtenstein's first work of public art. That's the city of Miami Beach's first work, but it is the artist's first work. So it's incredibly important. The thing is all painted outdoor sculpture, every bit of painted outdoor sculpture is intended to be repainted. It has to be repainted. The paint is never going to last more than, if you're lucky, 20 years. It's made to be sacrificial. They're designed that way. But how they're painted is the key to do it right, because you've got to get the color, the texture, the reflectance. That means the texture is it sprayed? Is it brushed? Is it rolled? Is the color exactly right? Most paint systems that were used in the 1980s don't really even exist anymore. So that's the key to painting these things properly. And there it is when we finished it. So now I'm going to give a little bit of extra time to two beloved projects. Of course, this one is the Miami Marine Stadium that I was brought into by Don Worth, who's sitting in the front row, who graciously opened my life to this amazing work of art. And talking about everything is connected, the architect of this building, Hilario Candela, was a student of Max Borges's, who built the Tropicana nightclub. He used to intern with him in Cuba, and the tradition of Cuban architectural thin shell concrete vaults is exactly what he had in mind when he was building this building. So when people talk about preservation and the meaning of preservation and why this is important, for a city like Miami to have a building that really brings the tradition of what construction was like in the mid-20th century in Cuba and has a living example of it here is something that is really quite remarkable, especially given the demographic of this city. So everybody here probably knows the story. The building was built in '63 for the purpose of watching speedboat racing, and then later it became used for concerts and many other kinds of wonderful community events. The building was never monetized properly. The press complained about it from its earliest years, and eventually the city used the excuse of Hurricane Andrew to shutter it, and saying that it was too damaged to be repaired. Engineering studies found that that wasn't the case, but nobody really wanted to do anything about it. And they just let it sit there to be demolished by neglect. And, you know, it has had some problems. You can see the steel is corroding, which is cracking the concrete. And that's, you know, a very serious problem that if left untouched over time will completely destroy the building. But more significantly, well, not more significantly in terms of overall damage, but in terms of its appearance, as the building was allowed to remain neglected, it was discovered by the street art community around 1997, and it's covered in graffiti, as we all know, and like or don't like, I like. And in some places, we're talking about hundreds of layers of graffiti because the building has been studied extensively. And lots of people have been working very hard, in particular Don Worth here in the front row, to make sure that it doesn't get totally demolished. But there's been a lot of work done on it. And what I've been fortunate to do, which I'll show you in a minute, is do some studies to test two key parts of it. One is, I've been brought in to do some technical studies on two different occasions. One under a grant from the Getty Foundation, and second under the grant that the city gave to do the actual plans for the conservation and repair and revitalization of the building through the architect himself, Hilario Candela, in partnership with Miami architect Rich Heisenbottle. And here what I did, so my role here has been fundamentally two things. Figuring out how to get the graffiti safely off the building without damaging the building, and figuring out how to repair the concrete. Because the thing about exposed, unpainted concrete is that its finish is its beauty. And most concrete that is repaired, like when you get your average contractor in to repair concrete, they just use a mix that will match the strength of the concrete, but not necessarily the appearance. And here it has to match the strength and the appearance. As part of the Getty Foundation grant, we conducted a charrette of sorts with the preservation community, the graffiti community, stakeholders, and the architect himself to talk about the future of graffiti at the stadium, because there are parties and there has been some movement to consider leaving graffiti on the building. And there's some technical reasons why it's not a good idea. But, you know, since I have my opinion about it that I won't share right this moment. But it was good to get everybody in the same room, because what the graffiti community said, which was astonishing. Well, Hilario Candela first said, you know what? I'm grateful to you guys for taking my building and doing something with it and readapting it and reusing it in a way that hadn't been conceived of before. And the graffiti guys said, you know what? If you fix it, if the city fixes it and takes care of it, we'll leave it alone. But if they leave it there and want it to fall apart, then it's ours. So this is what the testing looks like. Removing graffiti on a building like this, where you want to retain the beautiful concrete finish that was extremely deliberate, because in many interviews that I had with Hilario, he made very clear to me that he conceived of the concrete as a finish that was a thing of beauty unto itself. So one of the things about concrete mix development, and I'm hoping to lecture on this more later this year here, is that when you create these concrete mixes for buildings that are going to be exposed, you're working with strength, you're working with aggregate, color, but also the type of molds that you have to pour it into and what type of mold release agents. And then you don't really know what you're going to get for at least 6 months, because it takes no less than 6 months for that concrete to cure to its proper color. So it's a little bit of a hit or miss game that luckily people here seem to understand is necessary to getting the mix right. So anyway, so I'm going to just quickly talk about this building. Sometimes a treasured work of art is on a building that is acquired by someone, and it's not going to last because for some, reason it's going to go away. In this case, people recognize this. The Edificio José Martí that you could see from I-95 as you're boarding, down there. I can't exactly tell you where, like by Southwest 8th Street. And this fantastic mural from the 1960s, nobody really understood what it was. People thought it was Cuba, though it's not really Cuba. The building was acquired by Modani, the furniture company, and they wanted to put a showroom in there, and they wanted their products to be visible from the freeway. So they said, and it may be true or it may not be true, that that wall was not safe. So the artwork, it's not technically a mosaic. The artwork had to come off. All right. The thing is, a resident in the building, who is herself a developer, Nelly Santamarina, was appalled at the idea that this thing was going to just disappear. And she called us, and we talked to the contractor, and the developer and the contractor and us all got together and figured out a way how to partner with our directing the contractor in removing it and packing it. And we created this very large diagram photograph for putting it back together. And it's in storage right now. So if anybody has a big wall and wants to put this on it, see me. So this is another painted piece that is nearby. I just threw it in here because it's close to us. Again, this is the beautiful lighthouse by Tobias Rehberger, and I'm sorry for the sideways slide. But again, this is a painted outdoor sculpture commissioned by the city of Miami Beach. When you commission these painted outdoor sculptures, you gotta know what the paint is that the artists are using. And you gotta make sure that someone who knows a little bit about the longevity of paints vets it, because this paint was not so good. But it was repainted, it chipped, it was coming off, and the fluorescents are really not able to remain fluorescent in outdoor light of any sort, and certainly not ours. But we repainted this piece recently. We did it, just in 2023. The artist has said that it's okay with him if the fluorescent fades. The city has accepted it. I think they accepted it because it was pretty much a fait accompli. There was not really much to do about it. But that's the thing. If you're going to install a painted outdoor sculpture somewhere, just know you're going to repaint it at some point. Oh, and here it is being painted. And the finished product. And now I want to get to my favorite project to conclude with. So does everyone remember this? The Versailles Hotel, the Jack Stewart Apollo mosaic on it. And I love this photograph that Mitch Novick gave us that says Faena is culture, especially considering what actually happened to the mural under their watch. Because in the restoration, the so-called restoration of the Versailles Hotel, which was essentially gutted, I don't know if by Faena or somebody else, but whoever, okay. They're my client. I have to be careful. Whoever decided to work on this building could have done what they did with the Jose Marti mosaic and say, look, we don't want that mural on there anymore. Can we please take it off safely? But they didn't. They hired a contractor who said, oh, we can handle this. Look at the detail on that. And this is where it wound up. Trashed in the Little River neighborhood, dumped on top of itself, growing mold, losing tesserae, corroding, the aluminum twisted and torqued and bent. And I remember when it was first taken down that Andres Vellucci of the Miami Herald wrote an article about it. And I wrote so many letters to people, and I know others did as well. And it just languished. Nobody knew where it was or what happened. And then what happened was the Aman Group, a hotel group that do luxury property hotels, is going to build a luxury hotel in the Versailles Hotel property. And the very forward-thinking public art manager, Brandy Reddick, who is no longer with Miami Beach Public Art, she had the great presence of mind to say, look, don't give us a work of public art, fund the restoration of the Apollo. And they brought us in, and we looked at it, we looked at this. We looked at this and they said, can this be restored? And I said, sure, of course. And this circles back to my book, because one of the things I write about in the book is when you understand the nature of damage, repair also is only possible if you believe it can be done. And repair is something that has to be conceptualized and visualized and really affirmed every step along the way. And if you begin with the idea that, well, I don't know, or with skepticism and doubt, you're never going to do it. We knew that we were going to have to do some testing to know for sure. I looked at this, and granted, I've done many of them, many mosaics. One of the things our firm has done around the world is remove these mid-century modern mosaics that people don't want anymore on buildings and help people repurpose them, which is a giant task, but it's doable. And what we did is, we put together these tiered budgets for them to be able to convince their stakeholders. We gave them, we had to shoot in the dark a little bit, but we were pretty close. And the first step of it became gathering the pieces. Literally all those buckets of loose tesserae were just found in the grass and dirt next to where it was stored. It's covered in mold there where you see it. And so the steps were, what you do is when you have a project of this massiveness, you just kind of have to start Visualizing the low-hanging fruit. Okay, we got to pick up all the loose tesseract. Okay, we got to clean the mold. All right, once the mold's clean, then what do we got to see? We got to figure out the cracks. We got to figure out the steel. And by, you get there. You get there. Now, you could also hit a dead end, but I knew how to deal with concrete. And I did not do this treatment myself. It was our team that did it. And here we are working at one of the key parts to this treatment, and I'm almost finished, this is the end, was to work on something this big because it's 90 feet long and each piece weighs so much that you need a forklift just to turn it. We needed a place to work on it, and we needed a place to work on it outdoors that was safe and secure and where we could work. And Kathy Leff, a former director of this museum, who is now the director of the bakehouse, gave us space at the bakehouse. So everything aligned. And this is, we had to bring in Wovo each time we had to turn the pieces, forklift and turning them every time. We were working under this canopy, but you see them starting to come back to life there? Oh, this is our conservator talking about it, showing here where we had to channel out everywhere that the rebar was damaged, channel it out, clean off the corrosion, paint it with a corrosion inhibiting paint to secure it. And we had to have some welding done as well. Here you see our team setting the tiles back in one by one after everything. And that's the last step in the process, setting the tiles back in. And here it is, a drone shot overhead at the bakehouse as it is getting ready to be moved into storage. All the aluminum bits are cleaned and ready for reinstallation. It's going to be on a fire station that's being built here in Miami Beach. So thanks so much. I hope